So we've been talking about the major types of organisms, and we've been focusing on animals. And before we actually address the types of animals, we talked about the structures that are going to be important in differentiating them. All animals are going to be ingestive heterotrophs that have to consume food inside their bodies and then digest them. And they'll feed on other things because they're heterotrophs. And also the majority of them are going to be motile, or at least have some stage of their life where their cells are moving around. So that's another characteristic of animals. And then we talked about the fact of levels of organization. There are levels of organization for animals, and most of them will have tissue. We also talk about embryonic development, or the stages of development, and how that determines the fate of the animal. We talked about the tissue layers, which is very important. Each tissue layer will become a different kind of part or organ in the animal system. And also talk about cavities or body plans. So that some have internal cavities, some have fake internal cavities, and some have no cavities at all. And we also talk about the kinds of symmetry that animals will display. We had talked about cephalation, or the concentration of nerves in one end of the body. And we also talked about the way the cells split in the embryo, forming either mouth first or anus first kind of organisms, depending on the way that the cleavage and folding of that blastula actually took place. And that's deuterosomes versus protozomes. Finally, we talked about appendages and segmentation as a component of advanced animal types. Now let's talk about how these derived characters led to the formation of the animal groups. So the first and most simplest kind of animal is going to be the Poriferas, or sponges. They are living in salt water, and most of them live most of their life attached to the bottom of the ocean, although they have a stage where they actually freely move around. They have hollow central cavities with 2 layers of cells, but they not really have tissue. Everywhere you look at a sponge, it's about the same. So they really don't have tissue. And they can actually fragment their bodies. They can reproduce asexually and just kind of split in half. And they're very, very, very well at regenerating their pieces. But they can also reproduce sexually by putting their sperm and eggs into the water. And they meet in the water and produce new larvae that will then swim around and find a place to attach itself, where it will spend the rest of its life sessile, or attached to the bottom of the ocean. Now, very interesting kind of organism. We'll talk about in more detail later. So that it is at the beginning of the tree of life that we've been working on, the animals. Now, animals, of course, differentiate themselves from fungus because they're external heterotrophs. And now this derived character here is the presence of tissue. Sponges do not have it, so they had that way. If they have tissue, you're going to become the other kinds of animals. Now, among the animals that have tissue, some of them will actually have 2 layers of cells, and others will have 3 layers of cells. So that's the next derived character over here. If you have 2 layers of cells, in other words, from that blastula, you develop only the ectoderm and the endoderm, you're going to be an entozoan, which like a Cnidarian. But if you have 3 layers of tissue, you're going to be the rest of the animals. So let's talk about those dipoblastic animals that only have 2 layers of tissue. Cnidarians, that includes jellyfish, hydras, and corals. And they have 2 stages of their life, or some have actually spent their entire life in one of the stages. They have the polyp stage when they kind of face upwards like this, and they have the medusa stage when they face downwards like this. The majority of the animals spend the medusa stage for reproductive purposes, unless they spend their entire life like that, like the jellyfish. Most of their life is spent like that. Now, they live in the water. The majority of them are actually salt water, although hydras actually live in fresh water. And they're going to have hollow body cavities with single openings. And that means the mouth and the anus are about the same thing. And they only have 2 layers of cell, like we talk about. They do have tissue, though. They have organization. They have nerve cells, skin cells, and things like that. They're going to be in that branch like we talked about because they do not have 3 layers of tissues. Everybody else is going to have 3 layers of tissues. So that's why the ones heading this way are going to be the ones with 3 layers of tissues. Okay? Now, among the organisms, animals that have tissue, or are tripoblastic in this case, you're going to have 3 major branches. Now, you're going to have some which are going to be have internal cavities, and others which will not. So you see here that there's basically a 3-way split that's going on there. That means we're not exactly clear at the order of evolution in that thing. But that's we were talking about the poly nature of the taxonomy tree. It happens when we're not sure at what order it happened. But we do know that there's 3 types here. There's a 3-way split, as you see. All the people who come this way will actually have internal cavities. They'll be coamulates, like we talked about in the previous video. All the people that go this way will have pseudocoamulates. They're going to have some sort of cavity, but not real cavities. And then you have the animals that do not have cavities at all, which are kind of called acoamylates. Now that includes the flatworms. Now flatworms are called flatworms because they have flat bodies. Most of them are going to be parasitic and living in water environments. There are saltwater and freshwater types of these, but most of them will be in the freshwater. And they have two eye spots in the front of their cephalo region. That means they have cephalation. They show this thing of having the majority of their nerves in one end of their body. They will also have symmetry. You see that they have a different kind of symmetry from the ones that the Cnidarians have. The Cnidarians were radial symmetry. These are the first ones to actually show bilateral symmetry. Sponges had absolutely no symmetry. Okay? Now, two main kinds of these are the tubularians. They're free living and they're going to live in the water. And you have the planarians, which are also freshwater tubularians. Okay? So the special type of them. And in fact, some taxonomists will put planarians in a completely different group because of enough differences that exist between them and the other plathelminths or flatworms. So these are the ones that do not have internal layers. But on the other branch, you remember we talked about this, you're going to have some worms that actually have internal cavities or kind of have internal cavities or pseudocoamylates. And these include rotiferers, which have like mouths, which are kind of like sharp mouths, and the nematoda. Now nematoda are going to be round. Now, these are the first kinds of animals that, in addition to have those, they're actually going to have two body openings. The planarians did not have two body openings. Their mouth and the anus were the same thing. But the nematodes will have a mouth, and then at the opposite end of their body, they'll have the anus. And so they're the first ones to show that kind of arrangement in the evolution of the animals. So they're going to be the nematodas. And the rotiferers are very similar to them. They just have sharp mouths in addition to that. Now, among the other branch, that's going to be the animals that actually have internal cavities, you're going to have another one of those unclear three-way splits. And this split is going to be about whether or not you are actually split in a certain way during your cleavage stage of your embryonic development. So see, some animals will have what is called radial splitting, and they will become deuterosomes that have anus first. And those are going to be all the ones down here, which include the echinoderms and vertebrates. Other animals will have no radial symmetry. They will have spirosymmetry instead, and they will become what we call proterosomes, and which includes the arthropods and mollusks and segmented worms. Other ones are kind of in between the two, and we call them like moss-like animals, and they are going to have a mixture of both protozomes and deuterosomes. And an example of that is what we call the lophophorates. And I'm not even going to talk about that. By the way, this is just a simplified version of animal diversity. There's a lot more types of animals which are not included here. These are just the major groups. Okay? Now, among the ones that actually are going to have this internal cavities, we're going to have, for example, the segmented worms. Now, the segmented worms are another group of worms that actually are familiar to the roundworms in the sense that they're round, but they have branches of their body, and each branch has repeating segments, like, nephridia, which allows them to excrete, nerve ganglion, which is a central control system, digestive branches, and things like that. And they have two body openings, just like the roundworms had, and they actually have hearts and brains at the beginning of their bodies. All right, and then examples of these are going to be tube worms and leeches, as well as earthworms that you find in the ground. So these are segmented worms, and they're going to be in the family of internal cavity animals that are protozomes, or divide radial symmetry and develop their mouth first from the blastropore, right? So they're going to be on this side here, and they're going to be among this group here. Now notice that the reason there's a split there, and the reason that they did not go to this side is because they do not have segmented bodies with appendages. So that's why they went there. They have segmented bodies, but they do not have appendages. But notice that all protozomes will have advanced organs, including the segmented worms we just described have these advanced organs that I mentioned. Another type is going to be the mollusca. Now, they're different from segmented worms in the sense that the mollusca are not really going to have segmented bodies, but they do have advanced organs. Now, there's two main kinds of mollusca. You have soft body mollusca, like the octopus and the squid. They actually have a very strong cephalation and very big brains. So you have octopus and squid. There's an example of a squid down there. And you also have the well-developed organs of all of these, but some of them actually have shells, including clams and oysters, and they live most of their life sessile, although they have larval stages where they actually move around. And you also have snails, which may or may not have shells, so that are also groups of mollusks, which are different groups, and those are called gastropoda because they move with the bottom of their bodies. Okay, so these are the groups of mollusks, and remember they're different from segmented worms because they do not have segmentation in their body, and that's the derived character that makes them split there. Remember, all the ones that went this way, though, did not have appendages. On the other hand, the arthropods have appendages. So you're going to go talk now about the arthropods. Now, arthropods are going to be the largest group of animals. There's so much variety among arthropods. And the cool thing about them is that they have multiple body segments. They have joint appendages with both legs and arms. They have exoskeletons made of chitin. It's a hard covering for them. And they have also, like all the other protozoans, well-developed organs, including organs to breathe. They have, some of them have gills, others have tubules to breathe, which we call trachea tubes. Others actually have special ways to excrete materials, which are called astronephridia. The ones we saw in segmented worms were protonephridia. You have all of these advanced organs we'll talk about when we do insects in more detail, and arthropods in some more detail. And that includes many groups of arthropods, which includes insects, spiders, crustaceans, and other things like millipedes and centipedes. And even extinct groups of arthropods like trilobites that you see up there. Now, and all of these groups of arthropods constitute the most diverse group of animals, all right? So, and they're going to be in that branch of the tree of life. Now, another branch of the tree of life, remember, includes the groups of animals which are in between protozoans and deuterozoans. And I'm not going to really talk about them. But let's talk about our deuterozoans, or the groups of animals that display radial cleavage in the embryonic stage, and therefore they split in a way that their mesoderms forms on the top, leading to the formation of anus first rather than mouth first from the blastopore. That includes the echinoderms and vertebrates. Let's talk about them. The echinoderms are going to be those spiny, skin, radial symmetry animals, which is weird as the return of the radial symmetry, because all the animals so far were bilateral symmetry, but this one is the only kind of advanced animal that actually has radial symmetry. It includes things like starfish, sand dollars, and sea cucumbers. And they have flexible arm and tube feet connected to what we call a water vascular system. And they have very complex nerve nets as well, but they don't have any cephalation. So it's kind of like a step sideways in the evolutionary process here. Cephalation was already present ever since you said they've had the flatworms, but now the Echinodermata is a special group that does not have that. And they are known for regeneration ability and they grow new body parts. By the way, I forgot to talk about this. All the groups of animals so far had extremely large variety of them and the ways that we produce as well. For example, the roundworms we talked about, some of them will actually produce sexually with internal fertilization, as well as the segmented worms and mollusks. But a lot of them will actually produce externally by putting their things in the water where they live. And you notice that the majority of the groups of animals we talked about so far have lived in the water. This is the animals that evolved early in the Cambrian time, in the beginning of the history of the Earth, doing what we call the Paleozoic era. So, but either way, these groups of animals are going to be also reproducing either sexually or asexually, and they actually have extremely hard regeneration capabilities, like the flatworms had, and some of the roundworms have as well. Cnidarians are a very, very cool group, and we'll talk more about it later in the year.